I remember the laughter first. That's what people don't tell you about the moments that reshape your life. They don't announce themselves with music or slow motion or anything cinematic at all. They start ordinary. They start with someone you know making a joke you've heard a dozen times before, and the two of you stumbling through a door you've walked through every day for 2 years, and the overhead light flickering the way it always does because you never bothered to change the bulb. It was late April, past midnight, but not quite morning. The kind of hour where the campus goes quiet except for distant voices carrying through open windows and the occasional car passing on the street below. We'd been out celebrating. Jonah had aced his last exam, some brutal upper-level psychology course he'd been dreading all semester. A few of us had gone to O'Malley's, the bar just off campus that never checked IDs too carefully, and we'd stayed longer than planned. We always did. By the time we made it back to the dorm, it was just the two of us. The others had peeled off one by one, headed to their own rooms, their own lives. Jonah was still talking as we climbed the stairs, something about his professor and how the exam had actually been easier than expected, and I was only half listening because I'd heard him stress about it for weeks, and now it was over, and his relief was palpable and contagious. He was drunk, not stumbling, not incoherent, but loose in the way that made his gestures bigger and his laugh louder and his words come faster, tumbling over each other. I was somewhere between sober and not, that pleasant middle ground where everything felt softer around the edges, but my thoughts were still my own. Our room was on the third floor of Harrison Hall, a building that had been old when my parents were in college and hadn't improved with age. The walls were thin, the heating was inconsistent, and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. But it was ours. We made it ours. Jonah's side was organized chaos. Textbooks stacked in precarious towers, band posters covering every inch of wall space, clothes draped over his desk chair in a way that somehow never bothered him. My side was neater, more controlled. Color-coded binders on the shelf, bed always made, nothing out of place. We'd joked about it since sophomore year when we'd first been assigned as roommates. He said I made him anxious. I said he made me tired. Neither of us meant it. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, and Jonah followed me inside, still riding the high of the night. He dropped his keys on his desk and leaned against the wall near his bed, running a hand through his hair. It was longer than it had been at the start of the semester, curling slightly at the ends in that careless way that somehow looked intentional on him. He was wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn 3 days in a row, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and jeans that were starting to fray at the knees. I set my own keys down more carefully, muscle memory guiding me to the exact spot on my desk where they always went. I was about to sit down when Jonah spoke, his voice cutting through the comfortable quiet we'd settled into. "You know something, Reese?" I looked up. His tone had shifted just slightly. The laughter was still there underneath, but something else had crept in. Something uncertain. "What?" I asked. He was watching me, eyes glassy but focused in a way that made my stomach tighten without knowing why. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then smiled, but it wasn't his usual smile. It was smaller, almost tentative. "You ruin everything for me." I blinked, processing the words, trying to match them to the playful expression on his face. I waited for the punchline, the clarification, the laugh that would signal this was another one of his jokes. But it didn't come. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, and I heard the caution in my own voice. Jonah pushed off the wall, taking a step closer. The room suddenly felt smaller, the space between us both too much and not enough. His smile was fading now, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "I can't even look at anyone else anymore," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic, like he was confessing to something he'd been trying not to say. The words hit me before I fully understood them. I felt them physically, a tightening in my chest, a skip in my pulse, the sudden awareness of my own breathing. I was still sitting on the edge of my bed, drink in hand, but I wasn't moving. I couldn't. "What?" I said again because it was the only word I could find. Jonah took another step, and now he was close enough that I could see the way his jaw tensed, the way his hands were shaking just slightly at his sides. He looked like he was bracing himself for something, like he'd started down a path he couldn't turn back from. "I mean it," he said, quieter now. "I've tried. I really have." but you're always there, in my head. While I'm supposed to be thinking about anything else, you're still there. The air in the room changed. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like someone had opened a window I didn't know existed, and everything that had been carefully contained between us was suddenly spilling out, visible and undeniable. My breath caught. The plastic cup in my hand felt too heavy. I set it down on the floor beside my bed, not trusting myself to hold it steady. Jonah was still watching me, waiting for something, for me to laugh it off, maybe, or to tell him to go to sleep, that he'd had too much to drink and wouldn't remember this in the morning. That's what I should have done. That would have been the easy thing, the safe thing. But I couldn't speak, because somewhere deep down, in a place I'd been carefully ignoring for longer than I wanted to admit, I already knew. I'd known for months, maybe longer. I know in the way I found myself listening for his laugh in crowded rooms, in the way I stayed up later than I needed to keep him company while he studied, in the way my chest ached every time he mentioned going home for break. And now here he was, saying it out loud, making it real, making it impossible to ignore. The laughter we'd brought back with us was gone completely now. The easy comfort we'd built over 2 years felt suddenly fragile, like glass held too tightly. Jonah's expression shifted, something like fear crossing his face when I didn't respond. He took a breath, steadying himself. And then he said it, the thing that would change everything, the thing I wouldn't be able to unhear no matter how hard I tried. I think I'm in love with you, Reese. The words settled into the room like dust, like smoke, like something that couldn't be taken back. And I still couldn't speak. I need to tell you who we were before that night, because context matters when everything falls apart. I was 21 that spring, a junior studying business administration because it seemed practical and my parents approved, and I'd never been the kind of person who chased dreams over stability. I like structure. I like knowing what came next. My life was mapped out in careful increments, graduate with honors, land an internship at a firm downtown, work my way up through roles that made sense on a resume. I kept my emotions filed away the same way. I kept my class notes organized and accessible only when necessary. People thought I was calm, collected. They used words like mature and responsible when they talked about me. And I let them because it was easier than explaining that I wasn't naturally calm at all. I just learned early that feelings were messy, that wanting things too openly invited disappointment, that the safest way to move through the world was to keep everything locked down tight and only show people what they expected to see. I'd had relationships before, too, if you counted them generously, both with women I'd met through classes or mutual friends, both ending quietly after a few months when it became clear I wasn't offering them whatever it was they needed. One of them told me I was too distant. The other just stopped texting. I hadn't fought for either of them, and I'd felt guilty about that for a while before deciding it was probably for the best. I told myself I was focusing on school, on building a foundation for the future. I told myself a lot of things. Jonah was 22, a year ahead of me, studying psychology with the kind of passion I'd never felt about anything academic. He wanted to work with kids someday, maybe in schools or community centers, places where he could actually make a difference instead of just collecting a paycheck. He talked about it the way other people talked about vacations they were planning or concerts they were excited about, with this light in his eyes that made you believe it would happen exactly the way he described. He was a contradiction in every possible way. Confident in crowded rooms, but anxious before exams. Loud with friends, but quiet when something actually mattered. He wore his heart openly in a way that terrified me, laughing too loud and caring too much and never seeming worried about who saw him do it. He dated casually, mostly women, sometimes mentioning a guy he'd gone out with once or twice, always ending things before they got serious. I'd asked him about it once, why he never let anything last, and he'd shrugged and said he hadn't found the right fit yet. He said it easily, like it didn't bother him, like he had all the time in the world to figure it out. We'd been roommates since sophomore year, paired up randomly by the housing lottery after my first roommate transferred and his previous one graduated. I'd been nervous about it initially. I liked my space, my routines, and Jonas seemed like the kind of person who would disrupt both. But somehow it worked. His chaos balanced my rigidity. My silence gave his energy somewhere to land. We fell into rhythms without trying. He'd make coffee in the morning while I organized my day. I'd quiz him before exams while he paced the room. We'd stay up late watching movies neither of us cared about just because being alone felt worse. We'd built something I didn't have words for. It wasn't the friendships I'd had in high school, surface level and circumstantial. It wasn't the polite acquaintanceships I maintained with people in my major. It was deeper than that, more essential. Jonah knew things about me I'd never told anyone else, that I call my younger sister every Sunday, even though we rarely had much to say, that I hated seafood but pretended to be allergic because it was easier than explaining that I sometimes stayed up past 3 in the morning when anxiety got too loud and needed the distraction of late-night television. And I knew him just as well. I knew he bit his nails when he was nervous, that he listened to the same playlist on repeat when he was stressed, that his parents' divorce when he was 14 still shaped the way he thought about relationships. I knew the exact tone his voice took when he was pretending to be fine but wasn't. I knew how to make him laugh when nothing else could. We had inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. We had a shared language built from 2 years of living in close quarters, of learning each other's patterns and boundaries and breaking points. We had trust, the kind that develops slowly and without announcement, where you stop worrying about being judged and start existing exactly as you are. But friendship, I was learning too late, has limits. It has edges you don't see until you've already crossed them. And once you cross them, once someone says something that reframes every moment that came before it, you can't go back to not knowing. That's what Jonah's confession did. It took everything I thought I understood about us and turned it inside out, exposing all the things I've been pretending not to see. The night started innocently enough. That's what I kept thinking afterward, when I replayed it over and over, searching for the moment where everything tilted. It was supposed to be simple, celebratory. Jonah had finished his last major exam, the one he'd been losing sleep over for weeks, convinced he'd failed despite studying more than I'd ever seen him study for anything. When he walked out of that exam room and texted me that it was over, that he'd actually done okay, I suggested we go out. Nothing elaborate, just drinks with a few friends, a chance to exhale before finals week really hit. We met up with Mason and Claire and a few others from Jonah's psych program at O'Malley's around 9. The bar was crowded the way it always was near the end of semester, full of students trying to blow off steam before the real pressure started. We claimed a corner table, ordered pitchers of beer that tasted like metal and bad decisions, and settled into the easy rhythm of people who'd spent too much time together to need constant conversation. Jonah was lighter than I'd seen him in weeks. The tension he'd been carrying in his shoulders was gone, replaced by the loose, easy version of him I liked best. He joked with Mason about their professor, argued playfully with Claire about some theory they'd covered in class, and kept catching my eye across the table like he wanted to make sure I was having a good time too. I was. Not because of the beer or the noise or the break from studying, but because watching Jonah happy made something in my chest feel less tight. We stayed later than planned. 1 pitcher became 2, then 3. People started leaving gradually, claiming early classes or unfinished papers, until it was just Jonah and me and the bass-heavy music and the sticky residue of spilled drinks on the table between us. He asked if I wanted another round. I said we probably shouldn't. He ordered it anyway, grinning at me like he knew I wouldn't actually argue, and he was right. Somewhere around midnight, we finally left. The walk back to campus was quiet in that particular way spring nights get, where the air smells like cut grass and possibility, and everything feels suspended between winter and summer, between one phase of life and the next. Jonah was talking, his words coming faster and looser than usual, jumping from topic to topic without transition. He talked about graduation, about how strange it would be to leave this place after 4 years, about all the things he'd miss. "I'm going to miss this," he said as we crossed the main quad, gesturing vaguely at the buildings around us, the pathways we'd walked 1,000 times. "You'll be fine," I told him. "You'll have a job lined up by summer and forget all about this place." He shook his head, slower than necessary, like the movement took effort. "That's not what I mean." I didn't ask him to clarify. Part of me already knew. In that way, you know things before you're ready to acknowledge them. We kept walking. When we got back to the room, everything felt normal at first. Familiar. Safe. Jonah tossed his keys onto his desk with the careless accuracy of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. I set mine down more carefully, then moved to sit on my bed, still holding my drink even though it was mostly empty. That's when his voice changed. "I'm gonna miss this," he said again, but softer this time, more specific. "Miss you." I tried to laugh it off, to keep things light. "You'll forget about me by summer," I said. "You'll be too busy with your new job and your new apartment and whatever else comes next." But Jonah wasn't laughing. He was looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between sadness and determination. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "You don't get it, Reese. I tried to, but you're still there. Always." The air in the room shifted. I felt it physically, the way you feel pressure changes before a storm. My heart was beating too fast, and I couldn't figure out why, couldn't understand what was happening, even though part of me absolutely could. Jonah took a step closer, then another. He was standing in the middle of our small room, in the space we'd navigated around each other for 2 years without ever colliding, and now that space felt impossibly small. I should have said something. Should have made a joke, or changed the subject, or done anything to redirect whatever was building between us. But I couldn't move. I was frozen there on the edge of my bed, watching him watching me, and all I could think was that this felt inevitable, like we'd been moving toward this moment since the day we met, and I'd just been too careful to see it. His voice was barely audible when he finally said it, broken and honest, and too raw to be dismissed as drunk rambling. "I think I'm in love with you, Reese." The words landed in the silence between us like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything we'd built together. And just like that, the celebration was over. The easy friendship we'd maintained for 2 years was over. The careful distance I'd kept between what I felt and what I admitted to feeling was over. Because you can't unhear something like that. You can't pretend it back into silence. The next morning, Jonah woke up like nothing had happened. I heard him before I saw him, the familiar sound of him stretching and groaning and fumbling for his phone on the nightstand. I'd been awake for over an hour by then, lying perfectly still in my bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that maybe he wouldn't remember. That maybe the alcohol had been enough to blur the edges of what he'd said, to erase it completely, to give us both an out. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You awake?" I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him sitting up in bed, hair sticking up in every direction, eyes squinting against the morning light filtering through our thin curtains. He looked completely normal, unbothered, like the world hadn't fundamentally shifted the night before. "Yeah," I said. "We have any food?" He swung his legs out of bed and stood, reaching for the sweatpants he'd left crumpled on the floor. "I'm starving." I should have felt relieved. This was the easy path, the one where we both pretended nothing had changed and went back to the comfortable routine we'd established. But instead I felt something close to anger, sharp and unfamiliar, because how could he just stand there asking about food when my hands were shaking so badly I'd had to shove them under my blanket so he wouldn't see? "There's probably cereal," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as I could manage. He nodded and shuffled toward the mini fridge we kept stocked with basics. I watched him move around the room. This person I'd lived with for 2 years, and tried to reconcile him with the person who'd stood in almost the same spot hours earlier and said he was in love with me. They felt like different people. Or maybe I was different now, and that was the problem. I got up eventually, went through the motions of my morning routine. Shower, coffee, organizing my notes for the day. Jonah was at his desk eating cereal straight from the box when I came back, scrolling through his phone with the kind of casual focus that suggested his mind was miles away from our room and what had happened in it. We didn't talk about it. Not that morning, not that afternoon when we crossed paths between classes, not that evening when we both ended up back in a room at the same time and sat in near silence while he worked on a paper and I pretended to read for my economics final. But something had changed anyway. I felt in the way I was suddenly hyper-aware of every sound he made, every movement in my peripheral vision. I felt it in the way my stomach tightened whenever he laughed at something on his phone, wondering if he was texting someone, if maybe he'd already moved on from whatever he'd felt the night before. I felt it in the spaces between our words, the pauses that had always been comfortable now stretched thin with things unsaid. Over the following days, The change became more obvious, subtle, but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Jonah still joked with me, still asked if I wanted to grab lunch or quiz him on his final exam material, but there was a hesitation now that hadn't existed before. Like he was constantly calibrating how close to get, how much to say, where the new boundaries were between us. And his glances, God, his glances, they lingered now in a way they never had, or maybe they always had, and I'd been too committed to not seeing it. I catch him watching me while I studied, his eyes unfocused like he was thinking about something else entirely. And when I'd look up, he'd glance away quickly, sometimes offering a small smile that felt apologetic, sometimes just returning to whatever he'd been doing. I started spending more time in the library, in the common areas, anywhere that wasn't our room where the air felt too heavy with everything we weren't discussing. But I couldn't avoid him completely, not when we shared 12 by 14 feet of living space, not when our lives had become so thoroughly intertwined over 2 years that separating them felt like trying to unknot thread that had been tied too many times. Mason asked me once if everything was okay between Jonah and me. We were at the dining hall, just the two of us, and he'd noticed something I thought I'd hidden better. "You guys seem weird lately," he said, picking at his fries. "Like tense or something." "We're fine," I told him. "Just stressed about finals." He accepted that answer because it was easier than pushing, and because it was probably partly true anyway. Everyone was stressed about finals. Everyone was on edge. It was a convenient excuse for the way Jonah and I now moved around each other like magnets with the wrong poles facing, never quite touching, never quite settling into the easy orbit we'd maintained before. The worst part wasn't the awkwardness. It was the not knowing. Because Jonah remembered, I was certain of that now, could see it in the way he sometimes opened his mouth like he was about to bring it up and then thought better of it. But I didn't know what he wanted me to do with that information. I didn't know if he expected a response, a rejection, some kind of clarity I couldn't provide because I didn't have any clarity to give. What terrified me most, though, was the question I couldn't stop asking myself in the quiet moments when I was alone. The question that kept me awake long after Jonah's breathing had evened out into sleep. Was I more afraid that he didn't mean it, or that he did? A week passed like that. 7 days of careful navigation, of conversations that stayed surface level, of pretending that everything was fine when we both knew it wasn't. 7 days of me rehearsing what I'd say if I ever found the courage to bring it up, only to lose that courage the moment I actually saw him. 7 days of Jonah being just present enough to keep things from completely falling apart, but distant enough that I knew he was protecting himself from whatever answer he thought I'd give. By the 8th day, I couldn't take it anymore. It was evening, that dead hour between dinner and sleep when the campus went quiet and our room felt even smaller than usual. Jonah was lying on his bed, scrolling through his phone, the blue light casting shadows across his face. I was at my desk, pretending to study for my economics final, but I'd been staring at the same page of notes for 20 minutes without absorbing a single word. The silence between us felt like a physical thing, something I could reach out and touch. It was suffocating me, making it impossible to breathe. And suddenly I realized that not knowing was worse than any answer he could give me, even the one I was afraid of. "Do you remember what you said that night?" I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet more harshly than I'd intended. Jonah looked up from his phone, and I watched something shift in his expression, a wariness that hadn't been there a second before. "What? When I said you were annoying." He tried to smile, to deflect with humor the way he always did when things got uncomfortable. "No." I turned in my chair to face him fully, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "The other thing." The smile faded. For a long moment, he didn't respond, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he sat up slowly, setting his phone down on the mattress beside him, and when he spoke his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Yeah, I remember." Those 3 words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. My hands were gripping the edge of my desk chair, so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I forced myself to keep going, to push past the fear lodged in my throat. And Jonah took a breath, running a hand through his hair in that gesture I'd seen him do 1,000 times when he was nervous or uncertain or trying to find the right words. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at me, and the vulnerability in his eyes made my chest ache. "And I meant it," he said simply, "but you don't have to say anything." The words hit me like a punch I should have seen coming, but somehow hadn't, because part of me had still been hoping desperately that maybe it had been the alcohol talking, that maybe in the harsh light of day and sobriety, those feelings would have evaporated into something more manageable, something we could laugh about years from now as a weird moment we'd shared and moved past. But he meant it. He was sitting there telling me he meant it, with that same honest, unguarded expression that made him terrible at poker and impossible to stay mad at, and I had no idea what to do with that information. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. All the words I'd rehearsed over the past week disappeared completely, leaving me with nothing but the racing of my pulse and the feeling that the room was somehow getting smaller, the walls pressing in. Jonah watched me struggle, and something sad flickered across his face. He nodded just slightly, like he'd expected this, like my silence was answer enough. "It's okay," he said softly. I knew it was a long shot. "That's not." I started, then stopped because I didn't know how to finish that sentence. "That's not what? That's not fair? That's not true? That's not the problem?" Every ending I could think of felt inadequate, felt like it would require explanations I didn't have. "You don't have to explain," Jonas said, and his voice was so gentle it made everything worse. "I get it. I do. We're friends, and I made it weird. I'm sorry for that." "You didn't make it weird," I said, finally finding my voice, even if it came out rough and uncertain. "You just said something true." He gave me a small, sad smile. Sometimes true things are the ones that make everything weird. I wanted to argue with that, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because he wasn't wrong. Truth had a way of destroying carefully maintained equilibriums, of forcing you to acknowledge things you've been content to ignore. I should have said something more. Should have told him that I'd been lying to myself for months, that I'd felt the shift between us long before that drunken confession, that every time he touched my shoulder or laughed at one of my terrible jokes or fell asleep on my bed while we watched movies, something in me responded in a way that went far beyond friendship. But I couldn't say any of that. The words were trapped behind years of conditioning, of learning to keep feelings locked down, of believing that wanting something too openly was the surest way to lose it. So instead, I just sat there, silent and helpless, while Jonah's sad smile said everything his words didn't. He understood. Of course he did. He'd always been better at reading people than I was, better at understanding the things left unsaid. And my silence, he knew, was an answer all its own. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of final exams and packing and the strange, liminal feeling of endings. Campus emptied gradually as people finished their last tests and headed home for summer, leaving behind the hollow echo of a place that had felt so alive just days before. Jonah and I moved around each other with the careful politeness of strangers, maintaining just enough normalcy to get through each day without falling completely apart. He'd found a summer internship in Boston, something with a youth outreach program that was exactly the kind of work he wanted to do. I was going back home to New Jersey, to a corporate internship my father had helped arrange, to a summer of pretending I had my life figured out. We talked about these plans months ago, excited about the opportunities, already making jokes about visiting each other. Now, those conversations felt like they'd happened in a different lifetime, between different versions of ourselves. Graduation came on a Thursday in mid-May, the campus lawn filled with families and cameras, and the kind of manufactured joy that comes from marking transitions you're not entirely ready for. I sat with my parents and my sister through the ceremony, watching as Jonah walked across the stage to receive his diploma, his grin wide and genuine even from a distance. My mother asked if we were going to say goodbye to him afterward. I told her we would, knowing I hadn't figured out how. By the time graduation weekend ended and the campus truly began to empty, our room looked like a crime scene of half-lived lives. Boxes stacked against walls, suitcases splayed open, the posters and pictures that had made the space ours now packed away or discarded. The room felt bigger without all our things in it, but also sadder, like we were erasing evidence that we'd ever been here at all. Jonah had packed efficiently, the way he did everything when it actually mattered. Most of his boxes were already loaded into his car, parked in a lot behind our building. He was leaving in the morning, driving up to Boston to start his internship the following week. I had 2 more days before my parents came to help me move out, 2 more days of rattling around in this space that would soon belong to someone else entirely. It was late afternoon when he came back to the room for the last of his things. I was sitting on my bed, trying to decide what books to keep and what to leave behind when I heard his key in the lock. My stomach dropped the way it had been dropping every time I saw him lately, that mixture of dread and longing I still didn't know how to name. "Guess this is it," he said, standing in the doorway with his keys in one hand, his expression carefully neutral. I looked up at him, this person I'd spent 2 years learning to read, and found I couldn't meet his eyes for more than a second. "Yeah, guess so." He moved into the room, heading toward his desk where he'd left a final bag of things he'd need for the drive. I watched him gather them, each movement familiar and foreign at once, and try to find words that would mean something, that would bridge the distance that had grown between us since that night. But I couldn't. Every sentence I started in my head died before it reached my mouth, too inadequate, or too revealing, or too late to matter. Jonah slung the bag over his shoulder and turned to face me. And for a moment, we just looked at each other across the small space that had contained our entire friendship. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd spent weeks carefully avoiding. He took a step toward me, then another, closing the distance until he was standing close enough that I had to tilt my head up slightly to maintain eye contact. He reached for the bag on his desk, and his hand brushed against mine where it rested on the edge of my bed. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent electricity through my entire body, and I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. Jonah's hand stilled. He looked down at where our fingers had touched, then back up at me, and in his eyes I saw every question I'd been too afraid to answer. "Still nothing to say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were gentle, not accusatory, but they cut through me anyway, because he was giving me one more chance, one final moment to say something that would change the trajectory of what came next, and I still couldn't do it. Fear had wrapped itself around my throat, around my heart, keeping everything locked inside where it felt safer, but also like it was slowly killing me. I shook my head helplessly, the movement small and defeated. Jonah held my gaze for another long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression. Resignation, maybe, acceptance of what my silence meant, of what I couldn't give him, even though part of me desperately wanted to. "You said enough for both of us." I finally managed, the words coming out rough and inadequate. He smiled at that, but it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. "Then I hope you remember it," he said softly. He picked up his bag, adjusting it on his shoulder, and moved toward the door. I wanted to call him back, to ask him to wait, to tell him everything I'd been too afraid to say. But my voice wouldn't work, and my body wouldn't move, and all I could do was watch as he reached for the door handle. He paused there, hand on the door, and looked back at me one more time. "Take care of yourself, Reese." "You too," I whispered. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality, like the end of something I hadn't been ready to lose. Summer passed the way summers do when you're trying not to think about something. Slowly, and then all at once. I worked my internship at the financial firm, commuted into the city 5 days a week, came home to my childhood bedroom that felt smaller than I remembered. My parents asked about school, about my plans for senior year, about Jonah once or twice before they stopped mentioning him. I gave them answers that satisfied without revealing anything real. I didn't hear from him. I told myself that was what I'd expected, what I'd earned with my silence. But every time my phone buzzed, I still felt that spike of hope followed immediately by disappointment when it was someone else. Anyone else. I thought about reaching out more times than I could count. Drafted messages I never sent, imagined phone calls I never made, rehearsed apologies for things I couldn't quite name. But every time I got close, fear wrapped itself around my throat again and reminded me that some silences, once established, become impossible to break. Fall arrived eventually, pulling me back to campus for my senior year. I requested a single room this time, told myself it was because I needed space to focus on my thesis and job applications, not because the thought of living with someone new in that same building felt like a betrayal of something I couldn't define. The room was smaller than the one I'd shared with Jonah, but it was mine alone. I unpacked methodically, arranging my things with the same careful precision I always had, and tried not to think about how quiet it was without his music playing, without his voice filling the spaces between my thoughts. It was October when I found the note. Mid-semester, the leaves turning gold and red outside my window, the air carrying that particular crispness that always made me think of new beginnings, even though this year felt more like an ending. I was still processing. I've been going through my books, organizing them for a paper I was writing, when I pulled out my copy of The Great Gatsby. It was a book Jonah had bought me sophomore year after I'd mentioned never reading it, insisting that my education was incomplete without it. I'd read it that summer, and we'd stayed up late one night arguing about whether Gatsby was romantic or delusional. Jonah had said both could be true. I'd said that was a cop-out. He'd laughed and told me I thought too much in binaries. The note fell out when I opened the book, a piece of notebook paper folded into quarters, the edges slightly worn like it had been handled before being tucked away. I recognized Jonah's handwriting immediately, that messy scrawl that always looked rushed even when he was taking his time. My hand shook as I unfolded it. The message was short, just 2 lines written in the center of the page. If I said too much, forget it. If I didn't say enough, know that I tried. I read it 3 times, then a 4th, my vision blurring slightly as I tried to absorb what it meant. When he'd written it, whether he'd meant for me to find it or if he'd forgotten it was there, one more thing he'd left behind without meaning to. I sat down on my bed, still holding the note, and felt something crack open in my chest. All the feelings I'd been carefully containing for months came rushing out at once. Regret and longing, and the sharp ache of missing someone who'd been right there in front of me until I'd let them walk away. I thought about that last moment in our dorm room, the way he'd looked at me and asked if I had anything to say, the way I'd shaken my head and watched him leave, too afraid to risk the vulnerability that honesty required. I thought about all the moments before that, the 2 years of friendship I'd convinced myself was enough, was all we needed to be. I thought about how he'd tried, how he'd been brave enough to say something true even knowing I might not say it back, how my silence had been its own kind of cruelty, even if I hadn't meant it that way. Outside my window, autumn was settling over campus the same way it had when Jonah and I first met, when we'd been randomly assigned as roommates and had no idea what we'd become to each other. The same season, the same university, the same trees shedding their leaves in preparation for winter. But I was different now, changed by knowing him, by losing him, by understanding too late what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge when it mattered. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the book, but I didn't put the book away. Instead, I set it on my desk where I could see it, a reminder of what I'd had and what I'd let slip through my fingers because I was too careful, too controlled, too committed to protecting myself from the very thing I'd wanted most. The room was quiet around me, empty in a way that felt permanent now. But I could still hear Jonah's laugh if I closed my eyes, could still remember the exact tone of his voice when he'd said my name, could still feel the weight of his words settling into the space between us that night in April. And even though he wasn't there anymore, even though I didn't know if I'd ever see him again or if too much time had passed for apologies to mean anything, I understood something I hadn't before. Some confessions don't need to be returned to change everything. They just need to be true. They just need to be said once in a moment of courage that reshapes every moment that came before and after. Jonah had given me that, and I'd given him silence. But at least now I knew what that silence had cost us both.